So I want to go over now ideas that we challenge in this course. There are 5 key ideas that we'll challenge throughout the semester. The first one is the idea that everything is natural. So inequality, racial segregation, gender. We'll learn that despite the dominant story in society, the evidence shows that these are not natural phenomena. Racial segregation, for example, was not created because people naturally did not want to be around those who were racially different. In fact, we'll learn that race, and first it was black and white, had to be created. People we now see as black and white, in fact, naturally integrated. We had to create laws to get them to separate from each other. Social change is linear. That's another idea that we challenge. The idea that racism or sexism is a thing of the past, that it's getting better. Social life is not that simple. Every study in the social sciences as a whole shows that patterns of change are complicated. Racist and sexist ideologies haven't disappeared, but they take new and more subtle forms. So most patterns in terms of inequality reveal a U-turn. Racial wage gaps, for example, or the wealth gap. It was getting better right after the civil rights movement. But then in the late 60s and 1970s, it reversed. Okay, that had to do with structural patterns, what was going on in society. So it wasn't that, oh, we had the civil rights movement and now everything's getting better. It's in the late 60s and 70s, we had a backlash to civil rights policies. So the idea was like, oh, we took care of it's the 70s. We took care of all those problems before. Those aren't really issues anymore. And we were saying that in the 70s. We said it again in the 90s. We said it in the early 2000s. Different decades we've said this. We've made this claim that things have gotten better. We don't need those civil rights policies. But it's interesting because today in 2016, we would look back at the 70s and say, of course, that was a time of racial inequality. But folks during that time, and we're saying that it wasn't, that we didn't need these policies. And that's when the backlash happened. And we saw a reversal of any trend towards racial equality that we were seeing originally. So social change is not linear. Things are not progressively going in one direction. They fluctuate based on what policies are in place and what's happening in larger society. Interestingly, it was during Reconstruction, right after slavery, right after slavery was supposed to end, that European Americans were saying that racism really isn't a problem, that African Americans really don't have an unfair disadvantage, and that was right after slavery. So that's important to keep in mind because we still make those claims today. Younger people are more progressive. Attitudes have more to do with cohort than with age. Okay, cohort meaning generation. It's not your age that's important in determining your attitudes. It's what you experience. So, for example, those who came up during the civil rights movement, that generation tends to have more progressive ideas than even newer generations or younger generations. So it's not about age. It's not, unfortunately, it's not a matter of waiting for all these old folks to die out in order for us to have change. It's more complicated than that, again. Media is just entertainment. We take a hard look at how racist and sexist images in media and in advertisement have a history. In my classes, we critiqued Disney films in the past, and that can be unsettling because many of us grew up with those films and think of them as completely innocent. So we challenge dominant ideologies in this course. Sometimes that feels uncomfortable, but again, discomfort is an important part of learning. Bootstraps or meritocracy myths, that certain groups gain success through hard work alone. There are inequalities in our educational system, where we live, our workplaces, that can impact success. And those inequalities have much to do with race, class, gender, and disability. The myth that it's just about hard work has become an ideology that helps to sustain that inequality. And we began documenting that since the 1970s. So these are all seemingly positive ideas that have negative consequences. And that is something that Robert Williams in 1970 began analyzing. So he laid out these seemingly positive core American values: equal opportunity, achievement and success, material comfort, activity and work, practicality and efficiency, democracy and enterprise, freedom. They all seem positive, but in sociology, psychology, business, and many other fields, scholars have begun to note the negative effects of these positive values. And some of my work addresses this issue. I study colorblind ideology. So that idea, I don't see color, I see people. It's well intended, but first of all, it's physically impossible not to see color unless you truly have a medical condition where you're colorblind. But seeing human skin color, that's a different story, right? And we've documented that. That's verified. But what is the intention when somebody objects and says, I don't see color, I see people? What's really going on there is that it's a strategy to deny that racism is a problem. It's a strategy to shut down any conversation around racism. Not naming the problem or refusing to acknowledge its existence doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, and it also prevents us from finding solutions. So there's a number of studies now in management, in psychology, and sociology, where we're rethinking positive thinking. Okay, a New York Times journalist, for example, was noting a study showing that fixating too vigorously on goals can distort an organization's overall mission in a desperate effort to meet some overly narrow target. Research by several business school professors suggests that employees consumed with goals were likelier to cut ethical corners. And one of these studies is described in the Wall Street Journal and speaks of the dangers of practicality. So there's a study done by management scholar Lisa Ordonez and her colleagues. And what they did was have participants make words from a set of random letters, like in Scrabble, the game Scrabble. The experiments let them report their progress anonymously. And what they found was that those given a specific target to reach, like they were told that this is the target you have to reach, lied far more frequently than those instructed merely to do your best. So goals may even lead to underachievement. We find this in studies of New York City taxi drivers. One team of economists concluded that these taxi drivers make less money in rainy weather than they could because they finished their work as soon as they reached their mental target of what constitutes a good day's earnings. So all of this is to start questioning. So see, a lot of these examples that I just talked about have to do with achievement and success, practicality, being efficient, activity and work, setting goals. All of those positive, well-intentioned ideologies do have negative impacts that we tend not to think about. So sociologists are interested in analyzing that. Here I've laid out for you in the PowerPoint some of those issues. Think about how these values affect your lives as students, right? If faculty and staff are expected to get things done fast, if we are supposed to have these goals, if we're supposed to be producing more and publishing more, how might that affect the advising you get? If we're supposed to be really efficient, right, how does that affect the time faculty and staff have for you? And this is true especially when we look at bureaucracy, sort of favorite topic of sociologists. And we're more concerned at looking at these issues on the societal rather than the individual level. When we do study individuals, it's to examine their behavior and how their behavior is affected by changing institutions. So we're not so concerned with individual differences. We're concerned with what's happening at the structural level to affect those individuals. And if you look at bureaucracy, this is a clear way to understand how structure and institutions affect behavior. These are the characteristics of a bureaucracy. So I've written a question here for you. How might these characteristics affect people's interactions? Okay, so if you are focused on hierarchy, if there's a specialization, think about your time in CUNY, right? Think about your time at Baruch. When you have a question that you need answered, when you need help with something, and you go to one office and they can't help you, what happens? Do you tend to get shifted around everywhere? Do they send you to that office and another office, and they tell you to talk to another person just so that you get brought back to the original person? That's something that we'll talk about on Wednesday. So think about how bureaucracy might affect people's behavior and how they relate to each other. It has to do with organizational culture. Whatever type of structure of organization you have, that will contribute to a certain organizational culture, and those structural characteristics are what affects people's behavior. So if you take those individuals who are in this bureaucracy, in this hierarchical organization, and put them in a non-hierarchical one, their behavior will change. Right? If the structure remains the same, people come and go. That process is what sociologists are interested in. We'll talk more about this on Wednesday. Again, if you have any questions, please email me and make sure that you complete those readings with Chapter 1 in the Mills reading for Wednesday and bring the promise to class. See you then.